He was 17, and he thought he knew the shape of winter. He had lived through 15 of them in the high country of western Colorado, in a valley the maps called Ute Hollow, and the settlers called nothing at all, and he believed, in the unbothered way that boys believe such things, that winter was a matter of wool and firewood and patience. His name was Caleb Wren. The year was 1887. The man he had been sent to live with was his mother's uncle, a thin, stooped figure named Ezra Thorn, who walked with his head bent forward as if he were always listening for something underground, and who carried, at all times and in all weathers, a short iron rod with a flattened end that he used for tapping. He tapped trees. He tapped stones. He tapped the frozen ground, in places where there was nothing to tap for, and he listened, and he wrote things down in a small leather book he kept buttoned inside his coat. Caleb had been sent because his mother was dying, and his father had no use for a boy who could not yet swing a full day's hammer. Ezra had agreed to take him in a letter of one sentence. The boy can come if he is willing to be quiet and to learn what he is shown. Caleb had not been quiet. He had not, in any meaningful way, learned. He had spent the autumn watching the old man tap at the base of trees and mutter the same phrase under his breath, over and over, like a prayer or a curse. The tree knows where the wind sleeps. Caleb had repeated it once, in town, to a boy his own age outside the general store at Cold Spring. They had laughed about it for the better part of an afternoon. The store sat at the bottom of the valley, where the wagon road bent around a stand of cottonwoods, and it was the only place in 40 miles where a man could buy lamp oil and hear the news at the same time. The proprietor was a wide, soft-handed man named Harlan Pike, who kept a brass cuspidor by the stove and a sharp tongue behind his teeth. Pike had known Ezra Thorn for 30 years. He had no patience for him. When Ezra walked in, on a cold morning in late October, with Caleb trailing behind him carrying a list of supplies written in pencil so faint it was almost not there, Pike looked up from his ledger and let out a small, weary sound that was not quite a laugh. "You still living in that tree, Ezra?" Pike said it as a statement, not a question. Ezra did not answer. He set the list on the counter. Pike read it without picking it up. 40 pounds of dried beans, he said. 10 pounds of salt, lamp oil, 4 gallons, hardtack, 60 pounds. He looked at Ezra. "You expecting the end of the world?" Ezra said. "I am expecting winter." Pike snorted. "Same thing the way you tell it." He turned to Caleb. "Boy," he said, "you got people back in the flats. You got a mother. You don't have to spend the cold months with a man who lives in a hole inside a tree. There's work in Cold Spring for a strong boy. Honest work. In a house with 4 walls and a chimney that points up like God intended." Caleb did not answer. He felt the heat rise up the back of his neck. He looked at the floor. There was a second man in the store, a young farrier named Tom Vance, who was perhaps 22 and who had a wife and a new child and the easy confidence of a man whose life had begun to settle. Vance was leaning against a stack of grain sacks. He grinned. He said, "Caleb, you tell your uncle the tree knows where the wind sleeps. Tell him that." And he laughed, and Pike laughed, and Caleb, before he understood what he was doing, laughed too. He laughed at his uncle, in front of his uncle, in a store full of men he wanted to be one of. Ezra did not look at him. He paid in coin. He counted the coin twice. He tipped his hat to Pike and walked out, and Caleb followed, and the bell on the door rang behind them like a thing that had heard everything. They rode back to the hollow in silence. The wagon was old and the mule was older, and the road climbed through aspens that had already shed their leaves, and the sky above the ridges was the color of pewter that has been left in the rain. Caleb wanted to apologize. He did not know how. He had not yet learned that some apologies cannot be made with words, that they must be made with years of work no one will ever see. He stared at his hands. They were not yet a man's hands. They were still the hands of someone who believed laughter was free. The hollow itself sat in a fold of the mountain where 3 small drainages met. It was a place Ezra had chosen 40 years before, when he was younger than Caleb was now, and had come west with nothing but a rifle and a copy of a book on natural philosophy that he had read until the binding fell apart. At the center of the hollow stood the tree. It was not a true sequoia in the strict sense. The giants of that name grew farther west, in the high meadows of California, but it was a great western juniper, ancient beyond reckoning, with a trunk 11 feet across at the base and a hollow at its heart large enough for 2 men to stand inside without stooping. Lightning had taken the top of it 100 years before, and rot had taken the heartwood after the lightning. and what remained was a living shell of bark and sapwood wrapped around an open chamber that smelled of cedar and old smoke and something else, something older, that Caleb could not name. Ezra had begun, the summer before Caleb arrived, to build inside it. He did not call it a house. He did not call it a shelter. He called it the work, and he spoke of it as if it were something already finished that he was only uncovering, the way a man uncovers a stone in a field by carting away the dirt around it. The first task he set Caleb to, in early September, was the digging of a trench. The trench ran from the base of the tree out and downhill for 40 feet, and it had to be exactly 2 feet wide and exactly 3 feet deep. And at the end of it, Caleb was to set a clay pipe that Ezra had fired himself in a small kiln behind the hollow. Caleb dug the trench. He asked what it was for. Ezra said, "For breath." Caleb waited for more. Ezra did not give more. He bent over the trench with his iron rod and tapped along its length, tilting his head, listening, marking small notches in the earth with the heel of his boot. The trench, Caleb did not yet understand, was a draft tube. It would draw cold air from the downhill side of the slope, where the air pooled at night, and feed it slowly into the base of the fire chamber inside the tree, providing a constant low draw that would keep smoke rising clean and keep the fire from smothering itself in still air. It was a thing Ezra had learned 50 years before, from a Welsh charcoal burner who had wintered in the Black Hills and who had drawn it for him in the dirt with a stick. Caleb did not learn this until spring. In September, all he knew was that he had dug a trench for breath, and that his hands were blistered, and that his uncle had not thanked him. The second task was the gathering of ash. Not firewood, ash. Cold, sifted, powdery ash, the kind that collects in the bottom of a well-tended stove after months of careful burning. Ezra had been saving it for 2 years in oak barrels. He had 3 barrels full. He needed, he said, 5. Caleb was sent to abandoned cabins, to old burn sites, to the leavings of summer cattle camps, with a wooden scoop and a burlap sack to bring back ash. He brought back ash for 3 weeks. He did not ask why. He suspected by then that asking would not help. Ezra would say something like, "Ash remembers the fire," and tap the side of the barrel and walk away. The ash, Caleb did not yet understand, would be packed in a 6-inch layer between 2 wooden walls inside the tree, forming an insulating mass that no commercial material on the frontier could match. Dry, sifted hardwood ash held still air in millions of tiny chambers between its particles. It did not settle, it did not rot, it did not burn because it had already burned. It was the closest thing to perfect insulation that a man with no money could find, and it was sitting, ignored, in every stovebox in the county. The third task in early October was the chaff. Wheat chaff and oat chaff, dry and clean, gathered from the threshing floors of farms down in the flats, where the farmers were happy to give it away because it had no use they could think of. Caleb made 4 trips with the wagon. He brought back chaff in canvas bags until the back of the hollow was stacked with them in tall, soft walls. The chaff would go into the upper cavity of the tree, packed loose around the sleeping platform, a second insulating layer above the ash. Ezra had read, in a Danish farming pamphlet translated badly into English, that chaff held warmth better than straw because its smaller particles broke the convection currents that straw allowed. Caleb did not know this. He stacked chaff. He cursed the chaff. He picked it out of his collar for weeks. In late October, on a morning when the first hard frost had crusted the grass and the breath of the mule hung in the still air like a small white country, Ezra woke Caleb before dawn and said, "Today we set the chimney." Caleb followed him out to the tree with a lantern. Ezra had already laid out the materials: 4 lengths of iron pipe, salvaged from a wrecked stage line, a clay collar, and a strange double-walled assembly made of 2 tin cans, one set inside the other, with a gap of perhaps 2 inches between them. The chimney would rise inside the hollow of the tree, vented through a hole bored in the lightning scar at the top. The gap between the 2 tins, Ezra explained, was for the cold air rising from the trench. The cold air would sheathe the chimney as it climbed, keeping the outer wall cool enough that it would not scorch the living tissue of the tree. Caleb said, "A chimney can't be cold. It won't draw." Ezra said, "The inner pipe draws. The outer sleeve keeps the tree alive. 2 skins. Like a man's coat," Caleb said. "That's not how chimneys work." Ezra looked at him for a long moment. He said, "You will understand this in February, or you will not understand it at all." He turned back to the work. Caleb watched him. The boy felt for the first time a small, uneasy thing in his chest, like a stone dropped into a still pond. By the middle of November, the work was complete. The trench ran clean. The The clay pipe drew cold air from the lower slope. The ash was packed between the inner and outer walls of a small wooden room built inside the hollow, 6 feet by 8 feet, with a sleeping platform raised 3 feet off the ground and a low door reinforced with iron. The chaff filled every cavity above the ceiling. The double-walled chimney rose through the lightning scar. A small iron stove, no larger than a bread box, sat at the center of the room. Ezra had set, in the floor beneath the stove, a flat stone the size of a wagon wheel, which he had hauled up from the creek the summer before. Caleb had asked, when the stone was being set, what it was for. Ezra had said, "It will hold the day's heat into the night. Stone forgets slowly." Caleb had nodded as if he understood. He did not understand. He understood, in a thin, abstract way, that the stone was a kind of battery for warmth, that fire heated stone, and stone released that heat slowly over hours as the fire died. It was the principle the old Pueblo builders had used in their cliff houses, the principle the Roman bath builders had used 1,000 years before that, the principle every cave-dwelling animal on Earth used without thinking. But Caleb did not yet feel it. He had not yet sat in a small dark space with a stone beneath him giving back, at midnight, the heat of a fire that had gone out at dusk. In the 3rd week of November, Ezra began to cough. It was a small cough at first, a clearing of the throat in the morning. By the end of the week it had moved into his chest, and by the 1st week of December it had taken up residence there in the way that some illnesses do, settling in for a long stay. Caleb rode down to Cold Spring on a gray afternoon and brought back the doctor, a tall, thin man named Merritt, who had been a battlefield surgeon in his younger years and who had no patience for foolishness. Merritt looked at Ezra and listened to his chest and said, "Pneumonia." He said it the way a man names a wolf he has seen before. He said, "You need to come down to town. You cannot stay up here in a hole in a tree." Ezra said, "I am not in a hole. I am in a tree." Merritt said, "You are going to die in it then." Ezra said, "A man dies where he has worked." He turned his face to the wall. Merritt looked at Caleb. He said, "Boy, you bring him down to town in the morning, or you bury him here in the spring. Those are your choices." He left medicine. He left instructions. He rode back down the mountain in the failing light, and Caleb stood in the doorway of the hollow tree and watched him go, and the cold came up out of the ground and into the soles of his boots, and for the first time he was afraid. In the morning Ezra was worse. By evening he could not stand. On the 3rd day, before the sun rose, Caleb hitched the mule to the wagon and wrapped his uncle in 3 blankets and a buffalo robe, and drove him down the mountain to Cold Spring as carefully as he had ever done anything in his life. Ezra did not speak on the ride down. His eyes were open. He watched the trees pass. Once, near the bottom of the road, he reached out and touched Caleb's sleeve and said, "The tree knows where the wind sleeps. Finish the work." Caleb said, "Yes, sir." He had not called Ezra sir before. The word came out of him like a thing he had been keeping in reserve for a long time. Ezra Thorn died in a back room of the boarding house at Cold Spring on the 14th of December, 1887, with the doctor present and a kind woman named Mrs. Beale holding a cloth to his forehead. He did not say anything at the end. He had said what he had to say on the road down. Caleb sat with the body for 2 hours, and then he went out into the cold street and stood looking up at the mountain, and he understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and without warning, that the storm Ezra had been preparing for was now his. He would face it alone, in a tree, in a structure he had helped to build but did not fully understand, with 3 months of provisions, and a stove and a stone and an iron rod, with a flattened end that he had taken from the dead man's coat without knowing why. He rode back up the mountain that afternoon. The first storm came on the 18th of December. It came without warning of the kind a man could read in the sky. The morning was clear. The afternoon was clear. At dusk the wind shifted from southwest to north, and within an hour the temperature had dropped 40 degrees, and by midnight the snow was falling so thick that Caleb could not see the door of the hollow tree from 10 feet away. He stood inside it with the small iron stove burning and the lamp lit and the wind howling around the trunk of the great juniper, and he listened. He listened the way Ezra had listened. The wind did not enter. It did not find a gap. It struck the curve of the tree and was turned and slid away, and the inside of the chamber was still. He sat for a long time in that stillness. He understood slowly the first lesson. The shape of the tree itself was the first defense. A round structure presents no flat surface to the wind. There is nothing for the wind to push against. It slides around. He had spent his whole life in square cabins that the wind beat upon like a drum. He had never been inside a round room in a storm. He had never known that wind could be answered by geometry. By the second day of the storm he had learned the second lesson. The trench. He could hear, when the stove was burning hot, a faint slow draw of air from the floor, cold air entering through the clay pipe, sliding under the stone, warming as it crossed the heat, and rising up the inner chimney. The fire did not smother. The smoke did not back up. The air in the chamber was always fresh and always slightly moving, but never cold. He thought of Ezra saying, for breath, and he understood, and he sat down on the platform and put his face in his hands for a long time. The storm lasted 6 days. On the 7th day, Caleb went out with a shovel and dug a path to the woodpile and back, and he saw that the snow had drifted past the windows of imaginary houses, past the roof lines of cabins that were not there, that the world outside the tree had been buried to a depth he had not known was possible. He stood in the path he had dug and looked up at the great juniper, and he saw that the snow had piled around its base in a perfect sloping ring, an additional layer of insulation that the shape of the tree had drawn around itself the way a sleeping animal draws its tail. He understood then why Ezra had chosen this tree, in this hollow, on this slope. He had not chosen it for the size of the chamber inside. He had chosen it for the way the wind would treat it. The second storm came on the 29th of December. The third came on the 7th of January. Between the storms there were days of brilliant cold, when the temperature did not rise above 20 below zero from dawn to dusk, and the snow squeaked underfoot like a thing complaining, and the air was so dry it cracked the lips and the corners of the eyes. Caleb learned in those days the third lesson, the stone. He kept the fire burning bright through the afternoon, when the sun warmed the south side of the tree, and then he let it burn low through the evening, and then he let it go out at midnight. And the stone, all night, gave back what it had been given. He woke in the deep cold hours before dawn, and the chamber was still warm, and he put his hand on the floor, and the stone was warm under his palm. And he thought of Ezra saying, "Stone forgets slowly," and he wept, once, briefly, and then he banked a new fire and slept again. There was a moment in the second week of January when he almost made a terrible mistake. He had run low on the chaff in the upper cavity. Not low in the sense that there was not enough. There was a great deal, but low in the sense that the bags had settled, and there was an empty space above the sleeping platform, perhaps 2 feet deep, where the chaff had compressed under its own weight. Caleb thought, looking at it, that he could use that space. He could store the rest of his hard tack up there, where the mice could not reach it. He could lift the platform a little. He could make the chamber bigger. He stood with his hand on the wooden cover that opened into the upper cavity. He thought, "I will pull this out." He thought, "I do not need this much chaff." He thought, "The ash in the walls is enough." A memory of Ezra's voice came to him then. It was not a dramatic memory. It was a thing Ezra had said in passing, in October, when they were packing the last of the chaff overhead. Ezra had said, "A man's body makes heat. Heat rises. The chaff above is where the warmth wants to go. If you let it go, it leaves you. Keep it overhead." Caleb took his hand off the cover. He stood there for a long moment in the lamplight, and he understood that he had been about to open his own roof. He had been about to remove the layer that kept his body's own warmth from rising away into the cold dome of the tree above. He sat down on the platform and he felt, for the first time since his uncle had died, the full weight of what he had nearly done. He had been about to undo, out of a small convenience, the thing that was keeping him alive. He thought, that night, about how much of survival is the discipline not to undo things you do not understand. He thought about how easy it would be, in a long winter, to slowly take apart a structure you had not built yourself, to slowly trade away each protection for a small comfort, until the protections were gone and the comforts were ash. He resolved, sitting there with the lamp burning and the wind moving across the top of the great tree, that he would not touch anything Ezra had built unless he could explain to himself in plain words why it was there. He could not explain everything, not yet, but he could refuse to undo what he could not explain. That was a smaller kind of wisdom, but it was a kind. The third storm was the worst. It came in the middle of January and it lasted 9 days, and the wind during it reached speeds that pulled trees out of the ground by their roots in the lower valleys, and 3 cabins in Cold Spring lost their roofs, and a family named Corhonen, who lived in a sod house on the North Flat, lost a child to the cold because their stovepipe iced over, and the smoke backed into the room, and the mother could not wake the boy. Caleb did not know any of this until spring. He sat inside the hollow tree, and he listened to the wind, and the wind did not enter. The chimney drew, the stone held, the chaff did not stir. He read by lamplight the books Ezra had left, a tattered natural philosophy, a Danish pamphlet on farm building, a small leather book of notes in his uncle's hand that he had not yet had the courage to open. He opened it, in the 8th day of the 3rd storm, and he read. The notes were not what he had expected. They were not instructions. They were not plans. They were observations, kept across 40 years, of how the wind moved in the hollow, of where the snow drifted and where it did not, of which trees the lightning had struck and which it had spared, of the temperature inside the great juniper, measured at different hours of different days in different seasons. The notes were the record of a man who had spent 40 years listening to a place before he built in it. Caleb understood, reading them, that the work he had thought took one summer had in fact taken a lifetime. The trench, the ash, the chaff, the stone, the chimney, these were the conclusions. The 40 years of listening were the argument. He closed the book carefully when he was done. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat, the same pocket where Ezra had kept it. He sat for a long time with his hand pressed against the cover through the wool. On the morning of the 17th of January, in the middle of the 3rd storm, Caleb made his one mistake of the winter. He let the stove run too hot. He had been cold, not dangerously cold, but uncomfortably cold, the kind of cold that gets into the small bones of the hand and stays there. And he had piled the firebox too full of dry pine, and the iron of the stove had glowed a dull cherry red, and the inner pipe of the double-walled chimney had begun to tick and pop in a way it had not done before. He had not understood, at first, what was happening. Then he had seen, with a small leap of horror, that a faint thread of smoke was coming from a crack in the wooden wall of the inner chamber, where the heat had begun to scorch the dry timber. He had thrown open the stove door and raked out half the coals into a tin bucket, and carried them outside into the storm and buried them in the snow, and he had come back in and stood watching the wall for an hour, and the smoke had stopped, and the wood had cooled, and the tree had not caught fire. He sat down afterward on the platform, and his hands shook for a long time. He had almost burned alive the structure his uncle had spent a lifetime building. He had almost killed himself by being cold. He thought, his hands shaking, that this too was a kind of lesson, that a man can be undone not by the storm outside, but by his own small impatience inside, that the discipline of a steady, modest fire was its own form of survival, and that the urge to be a little warmer, a little faster, was the urge that killed men in winter. He banked the fire small after that. He did not let it burn hot again until spring. The storms continued. Caleb lost count of them after a while. He kept a tally on the inner wall with a piece of charcoal, 1 mark for each day. But the marks ran together after a time, and he stopped counting. He read, he slept, he ate carefully from the stores. He went out on the still days, and walked the perimeter of the hollow, and listened to the great silence of a high country buried in snow. He thought about his mother. He thought about his father. He thought about Ezra, more than about either of them, and he found that he could no longer remember exactly the sound of his uncle's voice, only the shape of the things his uncle had said. He thought, often, about the laughter in Pike's store, about Tom Vance leaning against the grain sacks, about his own laugh, joining theirs. He did not punish himself for it. He had been 17 and he had wanted to belong. He understood that now. But he understood also that belonging to a circle of men who laughed at a wise man was a small and cheap thing, and that he had traded, for a moment of it, his uncle's good opinion. He could not get that opinion back. The dead do not revise. But he could carry, into whatever life remained to him, the knowledge of what that trade had cost. The thaw came late. It came on the 18th of March, with a wind out of the southwest that smelled of wet earth from somewhere far below, and the great snow on the south slopes began to slump, and water began to move under the crust, and the world remembered, slowly, what it had been before the winter. Caleb stood at the door of the hollow tree on the first warm afternoon, and he looked out at a country that had tried, for 90 days, to kill him and had failed. He thought, standing there, about the trench, about the ash, about the chaff and the stone and the double-walled chimney, about the round shape of the tree and the way the wind had been turned aside by it, about all the things that had been mocked in October in Pike's store, about the laughter that had followed his uncle out the door. He said aloud, to no one, the tree knows where the wind sleeps. He said it the way Ezra had said it. He did not say it as a joke. He did not say it as a prayer. He said it as a fact, The way a man names the country he has come to live in. He did not say it to anyone in town. He rode down to Cold Spring on the first dry day of April with the mule and the wagon, and he bought flour and salt and lamp oil from Harlan Pike. And Pike asked him how he had wintered, and Caleb said, "Well enough." Pike looked at him. Pike said, "Your uncle." Caleb said, "Buried in the spring of the year. We did it yesterday." Pike nodded. Pike said, "He was a strange man." Caleb said, "He was a careful man. There is a difference." Pike did not answer. Tom Vance came in while Caleb was loading the wagon. Vance had aged in 3 months in a way that suggested he had lost something. Caleb did not ask what. Vance said, "Wren, I heard about your uncle." Caleb said, "Yes." Vance said, "You stayed up there alone, all winter." Caleb said, "I did." Vance said, "In the tree." Caleb said, "In the tree." Vance looked at him for a long moment and did not say anything else. Caleb rode back up the mountain in the long spring light. He passed the place where he and Ezra had ridden in silence in October. He passed the aspens, beginning to bud. He passed the bend in the road where he had laughed in the store and felt, after, the heat rise up the back of his neck. He thought, riding past it, that he was not the same boy who had ridden down that road. He was not yet a man in the full sense. But he was no longer a boy who laughed at what he did not understand. That, too, was a kind of crossing. He came up over the last rise and saw the great juniper standing in the hollow, untouched, weathered, ancient, with the small dark mouth of the door at its base and the thin curl of smoke from the lightning scar at its crown. He stopped the wagon. He sat looking at it for a long time. He understood then what Ezra had been doing all those years with the iron rod and the leather book. He had been writing a letter. He had been writing it in the shape of a place. He had been writing it for someone he had not yet met, who would arrive in the autumn of his life, who would not understand it at first, who would laugh once in a store at the bottom of a valley, and then learn, slowly and at cost, what the letter said. Caleb folded the small leather book against his chest. He nodded, once, to no one. He drove the wagon down into the hollow. Wisdom does not always arrive in time to be thanked. But it arrives, and the ones who carry it forward become, in their turn, the strange old men whose nonsense the next boys will laugh at, until the winter comes, and the laughter ends, and the listening begins. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting in the quiet.